Hey guys, we're down here at the Paul Bunyan Show in Ohio, and we're selling flat tops. Go Team Flat Top!
That's a pole. We got a steel, grain works. We've got clearance in there.
So you can dial in.
Then we're pusher bolts.
The flat top was born when we encountered a problem trying to cut 8x8 post off 14 feet above the ground. And so we tried to search the internet to try to find a safe, efficient, accurate way to do it. And that's when this thing was born. Obviously, it was a rustic version, and we're on about revision 45 to get it to this point. But this is what it was initially intended to do, is to be able to mount on a vertical post, to be able to secure the guide, secure the saw. So basically, I can operate a chainsaw with 2 fingers, but I'm working off this 90-degree plane, so I can ensure all these are the correct height, and we're cut off square on top. And one of the big challenges that we had to tackle was obviously everybody doesn't have the same saw. So what we've done is we've machined an axle that's universal. So most saws, or most common saws, will have a 5/16 or an 8mm thread. So our axle is universal. So we've got 5/16 on one half, 8mm on the other. So we're going to replace your nut with our axle. That way we can marry any saw with a bar stud up to our saw guide. Now when we mount the saw in the guide, one thing that we don't want to happen is we don't want to allow the saw to come 360 degrees around this axis, because we don't want it to be able to come and get us on this side or on the opposite side. So we have installed what we're calling a safety pin that protrudes from the side of the axle. Now we've machined in the bushing, we've got a safety slot that will control the working motion of the saw. So every saw will tighten at a different point. So that's the reason on this bushing, we've got a 12-point socket on the bottom side. So with the 4 set screws, we can maneuver this bushing around to line up with the saw that you have. In this case, we've got it set up in a vertical fashion. I'll install the saw and we'll make a level cut. Now that definitely beats marking a liner all the way around 4 corners and having to take a circular saw and cut all the way around the beam. So that's a straight fashion, but on top, we have an angle gauge on both sides. So we're treating the bottom of the guide as our pivot, and then we've got 0 to 45 degrees on opposite sides. So if I want to make a miter cut to 22.5 degrees, I bring it to my scale. I can clamp the guide down here, and we can make that cut. If I need 45, I can manipulate the guide up to 45 degrees and make that cut. If I want 10 degrees, I can move it to there and lock it in place. We'll make a 10-degree angle cut on this post now that we have it flat. Now if I'm making repeated cuts and I want the same angle over and over and over, along with our clamps that basically have retaining pins, they slide in and out, install them back in place, they lock in place. Now if I want to make repeated angle cuts, what I'll typically do is we can use the saw guide with the saw in a chop saw fashion. So I've essentially cut a 22.5 degree block, and instead of using the clamps, I have the option to screw it to the post if I like. But I'll use one of the screw holes and I'll screw my 22.5 degree block on the interior of the saw guide. And then every time I place it on a post, I've got myself at that same angle. But I leave my block protruding on the first cut, and I'll show you why. Now the reason I want to leave my wedge protruding on the first cut is when I make this initial cut, we're going to attain a zero clearance. So the next cut we make, I've established my zero clearance. So now all I need, if I want to make that same 22.5 degree cut, all I have to do is have a mark where I want that cut to begin. I slide my block up, tighten everything down, and I know exactly where my bar is going to hit, and I don't have to worry about trying to line the bar of the saw up with that mark. Now, not all poles and posts are created equal, so in this case we've got a bigger version. So we've got a 12x12 post. Obviously we're running a little bigger saw here. Scotty, go ahead and make a cut. Imagine being 12 foot in the air trying to cut a 12x12 off and try to cut it off square. Not an easy task, but the saw guide makes it a lot easier. Now the only limitation you're going to get on how big a wood you can cut is the length of that bar. And so in this case, a 12x12, we have no problem. Also in the vertical fashion is sometimes you'll run into cutting posts. Somebody builds a barn out of telephone poles, and we've got a round post that we're trying to square off. On round stock, typically in light poles or big poles, you're going to have tapers at the top. You're going to have bows and twists. So with a round post adapter, we'll go ahead and make this cut. Obviously we're cutting a log round, but we'll cut this off, and we've got a level bubble on the top of the saw guide that allow us, even with it bowed or twisted, we can level the guide. So that way when we cut the top off and you're setting your top plates, we don't have to worry about you cutting with the bow of the tree or the pole in that case. Go ahead and cut this one off. Now even with our post, obviously you can tell is leaning one direction. We can use the level bubble on top to set the plane of how we want that saw to travel. So even on a twisted leaning pole, we can cut that top of that pole straight and flat. That way our top plate lays down good and flat. Now in most cases, if we center the bushing in our housing, it's going to put your saw on plane. But every now and then you may run into a saw that we don't have a 90-degree relationship between the bar and the bar stud. So what we've done is we've engineered our housing to where bushing has play. So we've got 4 set screws that we can manipulate this bushing to bring, if your saw's 3 degrees out, we can manipulate our bushing to bring you in a parallel plane with our guide. So in the last case where we're using this level to control the top of the cut, we can manipulate your bar. So if your saw is cutting out, we can manipulate the bushing to bring it in plane, or if it's tweaked one way left or right, we can use the side set screws to bring everything true. Now it was born to be used in the vertical fashion, but we found it's really handy if we use it horizontally. Now, I mentioned before, we don't have to use the clamps if we don't want to. We've got these screw holes that we can mount by. So what we've done is, in my case, I've got a piece of plywood for a table. I found a straight 2x4, I've screwed it to it, so that's creating my fence. So we turn this chainsaw at this point into a chop saw. So on the initial setup, basically what I'm gonna do is I'll use a framing square and I'm gonna square my saw bar to my fence. Now every fence may not be true, so that's the reason I wanna square to this fence, so I will bring my bar down. I can tweak this positioning to where I can make sure I've got a 90-degree plane between my fence and my bar. Once I've done that, I can make that first initial cut, and like we used the wedge earlier, this is gonna give me my zero clearance, so when I make my first cut, I don't have to worry about drawing square lines on my material. I know that this is 0, so as long as I've got a mark on where I want my cut to be made, I bring it out to my 0 clearance line and make my cut. And that works well, obviously cutting 4x6s, 6x6s, 8x8s, whatever size beam. The only limitation again is the size of the bar. But if we've got some other jigs and fixtures set up here, but if we just throw a sheet of 4x8 plywood up on a set of sawhorses to where we got full range of motion, let's just say we wanted to cut a 412 pitch on a rafter tail. So I can, versus having to move my saw guide, I can move my material to the angle that I want. Now, in simple fashion, once I've found the angle that I want, I can bring a stop block in, clamp this down, so every time I come, I've got that same angle. So we'll make a brief cut here, and let's just say that's close to a 3 or 412 pitch. We can flip our material around. As long as we're on our stop block, we can come back and cut the opposite end of our rafter. Well, there's plenty of possibilities with this FlatTop saw guide, but we've showed you just a few here today. But follow us on our YouTube channel. We'll try to stick some tips and tricks on there over time. But if you got some questions or want more information, go to our website, flattopproducts.com. And we hope you cut wood like never before.